of Washington Historical Society annual tea held on Saturday, July 28th in the year 2001. And the annual tea this year is being held at the Blythewood in Harts Village, Millbrook, New York. It's the home of Barbara and Frank Nolan and family. Our narrator today will be David Greenwood, the Town of Washington and the Village of Millbrook historian. He will be showing the grounds to us and revealing the history of the early 19th century house. This was the original home of the Downing family, and there was a Downing orchard location there.
Thank you. We're really lucky with the weather. Yesterday I spent the entire day from sunrise to sunset in Putnam County at the 4-H fair. And we have a school bus in my district that's been converted to a mobile art museum called the Van Gogh. And it's filled with student artwork. Well, I spent the entire day under an awning in front of that bus yesterday thinking it had to be the most beautiful day that I could remember. It was perfect outside. And here we are blessed again with another great, great day. And it's a terrific day to be able to walk around the house. What we're going to do, I'll spend a few minutes talking about the history of the property in the house, and then for those of you who are interested, we'll walk around the house and I'll point out some of the features for you, because what you see is very deceptive. And I'll point out some of the things of what the original house looked like when it was built about 1821, 1822. Then we'll come back here and have the refreshments that you brought. The property that we're on was owned by Philip Hart in the 1770s. Philip Hart owned over 1,000 acres in this immediate neighborhood. Stephanie Morey, some of you know Stephanie, who's working very closely with the Conservation Commission and has for a number of years, has tracked down most of the parcels. About 2/3 of Philip Hart's property is what would now be the Hitchcock estate, Daheim, and that lake that's in front of Hitchcock was known as Philip Hart's Pond. The last meeting that we had was the walk through the cemetery, and for those of you who were there, I pointed out Philip Hart's tombstone, and we talked briefly about the Quaker meeting house and the Nine Partners School. Now, what does that have to do with this? A great deal, because Philip Hart gave this piece of property to his youngest daughter when she married Isaac Merritt. The Merritt family, another Quaker family, was from Quaker Hill. As a matter of fact, they had the first store on Quaker Hill. Philip Hart was involved with mills and textiles. He was basically a merchant. He never really worked in the mills himself. He hired people to work in the mills. Philip Hart's daughter, Elizabeth, married Isaac Merritt, and Philip built the house, this house, for them when they were married. So let me back up. Depending on how old you are or how long you've lived in Millbrook, the house has a lot of different names. If you're really old, pre-1870, you know it as the Merritt Homestead, and it was called Pleasant Mount. Pleasant Mount. Isaac's wife died in 1848. She'd had 7 children, and in 1848 she died. And Isaac married his second wife, actually a cousin from Quaker Hill, and they had another son in this house. And then they sold the property in 1870 and moved to New York. Isaac Merritt's cousin was Franklin Merritt. And you think of Franklin Avenue and Merritt Avenue in the village, that was Isaac's cousin, who actually laid out the property in 1870. An interesting aside, the Merritt for that name is the same Merritt for the Merritt bookstore. And I've said this before, but it's such a coincidence. When Scott moved the bookstore to that location, we talked about Merritt Avenue and the association. And Scott's father's middle name was Merritt. And Scott said, oh yes, but that's Merritt from Merritt Parkway in Connecticut. Fine. Isaac Merritt's brother was that Merrick's father. So the Merrick connection. So Scott's relation to this house. Isn't that a small world, how things happen? The older I get, the more that seems to be the place. So the original house was much smaller than the one we're looking at now. When we walk around, I'll explain it. In 1870, the Merrick family sold Pleasant Mount to the Smith family. And the Smith family were friends of the Merricks because 2 doors down was Smith and Tompkins department store in Harts Village. And in 1870, Mr. Smith said, with the railroad coming, I'm moving. And he built in 1870 the first department store. It's still there, right across what had been the railroad tracks. And of course we know it as Spagnola's, or depending on the name that you associate with it, that's the village department store. And Smith bought the house in 1870 and lived here until his death. Now the rest of the connection I'm going to read, because bless Louise Tompkins, in 1972 she wrote an article for our Historical Society's newsletter, and this is what she had to say. September of 1973. Blythewood. The very name of this farm conjures up in one's mind a picture of a happy home filled with laughter of children, and so it was. William E. Smith lived here with his family. Mr. Smith has been called the father of Millbrook. In 1870, he and his partner, Claude Tompkins, opened the first store in Millbrook. At that time, there were only 6 farmhouses in the vicinity, and scarcely a tree in sight. The first post office in the new village was situated in this store, which of course is still standing. And it's now owned by Joseph Spagnola. Mr. Smith was, of course, the first postmaster. He was a strong supporter of the Dutch Reformed Church in the vicinity and a promoter of every good cause in this community. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and some of you know this is Smiths, were the parents of 3 children, a son, William D. Smith, and 2 daughters, Mary Elizabeth and Henrietta. Do you know where this is going? Okay. As these children grew up, Blythewood became a social center for the young folks of the community. When Mr. Tompkins retired from the firm, William D. joined his father as a partner. He remained there until he accepted a position at Lucky Platt and Company in Poughkeepsie. Eventually, he became an executive of that firm. He made his home in Poughkeepsie after that, but he never lost his love for Blythewood and always looked forward to family gatherings there. Mary Elizabeth Smith never married. She spent her time as secretary of the Millbrook Free Library Association and assisting with worthy causes in this village. Henrietta Smith married Harry Downing, who established an orchard at Blythewood. And talking about an orchard, it's your time to talk about your dad.
Well, my grandfather,
or grandfather.
Philip Cole. Now he lived down on near Poughkeepsie on what's that saying the name of the Van Wagner Road. Now how my Mr. Downing knew from my grandfather that was an orchard man, and so that nature. So he asked my grandfather if he come up and see the layout of this land to here. And when my father found out from this here, right on up, well, when my father lived down here where Downing, so that nature, it's all a clay soil, and for orchards of that nature, it holds the moisture of the trees, and it's high enough so the frost won't hit your apples. And if you put the trees down the lowland, the frost will hit the apples. So this area in here it was all apples. So he planted all the apple trees, which be McIntosh and stuff that nature. Then he had blueberries, grapes, and then Mr. Downing had, I think, 1 or 2 horses and 2 cows and stuff of that nature onto it. And so my grandfather planted all these apple trees here. So then my grandfather had 4 boys, which my father grew up in here. So that nature. So that's where my father grew up in here. And then then I think there was a church down here, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that used to be the packing house, and so that nature. And then they had for picking apples, they always go down to the village and ask the boys to go down and pick apples. Then in the winter, and in 1960, Edgar had a son and daughter, and Edgar lived here, and then up here where Spagnola lives now used to be Sheldon's. And I was married in 53, and then in 60 I moved up to Sheldon's, and my wife and I she had places for the strawberries, and that was her job, to take the strawberries and stuff that nature onto for Edgar and Harry and stuff down there. But he said my father, when he grew up in here, up here on top of the hill, house in here, he said, what a beautiful sunsets. He used to come here, you see the storms coming, it was been beautiful in here. Yeah, so
the very top of the orchard had a little Gothic revival story-and-a-half house that was still recognizable. It wasn't standing, but it was recognizable when Barbara Nolan and her husband Frank bought the property in the 1880s. So let me continue.
1880s or 1980s?
1980s. Sorry, I'm in the wrong century here. In the orchard, there were different varieties of apple trees. Besides pear, peach, plum trees, people came from far and near to purchase the delicious fruit picked from these trees. Harry and Henrietta's son, Edgar Downing, continued and expanded the work of his father. The Downing strawberries were the best available and were purchased the minute they ripened. And his strawberry patch, some of you may remember, was directly across the street where the bonus house is. And the strawberries took full advantage of the sun on that. It was perfect because it was on the incline for it. And we've got pictures of that strawberry patch too. Edgar Downing passed away a few years ago, and none of his children were interested in the orchard. It has been operated by different partners since Mr. Downing's death, but now it's been sold after having been in the same family for more than a century. And now it's time to talk about Bryce, because Bryce, you looked at the house just about that time. What's your recollection?
Oh, that was 31 years ago.
Yeah? Sure.
And I don't know why we didn't buy it.
Yeah, I just went through it once, and then I was here once when Karen Martin owned it, and I haven't seen it since. But lovely old house.
Clancy bought it instead of you, right? At that time, Bryce, was it?
I don't remember.
Fellow from Columbia County?
Could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but
Karen had,
and there used to be a house. There used to be a house up on the road here
at
too.
that time, I wish you had bought it because Clancy didn't care about it.
There were a number of outbuildings, a couple of other early houses.
Yeah, the road that went up the back, there was a house up.
On the left, that's
Well,
where my
Bob,
grandmother
that's where
lived.
your
Oh,
father
okay.
That's where my
lived, in
grandmother
that
lived,
little
right, yeah.
tenement house up there.
Yeah.
And
Right,
that's the
yeah,
one,
sure.
that's the one that's no longer standing.
Yeah, right, yeah, right.
Right
yeah,
at the
yeah.
top, and it was right at the crest.
Crest, yeah.
So it was a fabulous view.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons that had been originally called Pleasant Mount, because from the top you could see everything.
Mhm.
And Frank cleared, Frank bought about 24 acres in the back and cleared a lot of it so that the family could have picnics up there. And it was wonderful
Yeah,
to
beautiful,
look
yeah.
out. Fabulous
They
view.
say that my grandmother said what beautiful sunsets and stuff that nature they had of it. When, cause I was born in Poughkeepsie, then I came up here. My father bought the Swift's house down here in 1930. So then the railroad in 1932 they turned down, but I can still remember stuff of that nature onto it. But I remember Edgar always got up about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and sprayed his apple trees with the dew, and you could see they were spraying Malathon and stuff. Came down to our valley. We never had any flies or mosquitoes or that, which made it nice. So that nature onto it. But it is beautiful up through here. It's really with the apple trees or something.
Some other history of the house, just continuing on. Some other history. So Karen Martin lived here for a number of years, and Karen changed the floor plan on the inside. I'll talk briefly about that as we walk around the house and the reason for it. Then Karen sold it to the Days, and the Days sold it to Barbara and Frank Nolan in 1985, 86? Just about that time. 85. So that's sort of the evolution in terms of the property as it continued. The buildings you're looking at, in addition to the house, Harold mentioned the building that was insulated for apples. Some of you remember the Harts rather.
Mhm.
The Harts. The first house, as you turn on Valley Farm Road on the right-hand side, isn't really a house. That was the apple storage area,
Right.
and the Harts expanded and changed and made it into their home. One of the things that they talked about was, of course, the walls are very thick, and it was packed with sawdust from
Cork.
the lumber mill,
And cork. You could smell the cork. Warm day.
and that's how they insulated it. And they would pack it up with the apples, and they'd have apples nearly year-round. The other buildings that you see are all farm-related. The carriage house is the second one in the distance. The small one that you see, Barbara and I have conjectured what it was, but it was finished, so it may well have been a tenant house. When some of you came here to buy apples and things, do you remember where you bought the apples? Where did you pay for it?
Down to the packing house down here.
Was at
No.
the packing
Yes,
house?
at the packing-
Never here at the
No,
house?
no.
Well, and
As far as
also
I
at
know,
that
this
little.
It was like a horse barn, some of that for cattle.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I can remember, the only one was up on the left-hand side. That's about the only house was here, then the Downing house here.
Okay. There's also what appears to be the concrete foundation for a silo.
Yeah,
Isn't-
right.
Yeah.
They did. They had. I think it had
Yeah,
two, 4 or 5 horses, and then they had 2 milking cows, stuff of that nature. And
Okay.
small stock, stuff of that nature.
So the ghost of those, or the footprint of those buildings, are still there on the side. When, well, let's take our walk around.
Before
Well,
we
just
do
a question
that,
for Bob. Was Rufus here with your dad?
Yeah,
then?
Rufus down
Rufus
here.
was here with your dad.
Rufus here. Then they had, let me see, Rufus.
Yeah.
Let me see. There's a couple other people that helped out here, just pruning apple trees
Yeah.
in January and February, so that nature. They kept on more or less all year round. Not only for apples and stuff of that nature, and pruning with the grapes and the apple trees, so that nature.
Okay.
Where exactly were the apple orchards?
Was up
Oh.
in here, up in here.
All up the crest.
Yeah, see, I used to help, of course, I'm 72 right now, but I always helped when Edgar was spraying so that night to help him spray, then we had 2 tractors. I helped mow round the trees of that nature, because we had small tractors, and we could round this of that nature. And then I know when we lived to Sheldon's up here, he said now, the crows are ruining the apples. So he said, you have permission to shoot all the crows so they won't get at the apples. So that's it. We lived up to Sheldon for about 8 years. So then
Some other associations with the house. Mary Downing.
right.
When we moved in, Mary came to visit and spoke a lot about the Philip Hart house. Well, it's over there.
Right, yeah.
You remember last year with the tour. And Mary had many recollections about that, and gave Frank and Barbara a photograph that she had of the house that was in the house when the Smiths bought it, and it's called the Merritt Homestead. And the house, the way you see it, is pretty much the way the Merritts left it, but the original house was half the size of it. I'll pass around a photocopy of that photograph that Barbara has the original of from the Downings. And the house hasn't changed too much, but you'll notice in the gable end there are quarter windows. They're actually phony windows, just like the Philip Hart house has. And they've been covered, so you get the half-round window, but there would have been a quarter in each corner. There's aluminum siding on it, actually, that the Days put on the house, and that's covering it.
Before you go into your driveway,
Yeah.
there was an old house, I can just remember, on the left-hand side there.
Yep.
I don't know if you have any pictures of it.
Yeah, we have a front picture, a back picture of the house, and the front when it was being dismantled.
Yeah.
Barbara Place, Barbara Otis,
Right?
Hunt Otis's daughter, married Fred Place, and the Places were tenants in that house.
Right. And it's all, the first story was I remember that back in 1930, I think.
Yeah.
31 to 32, I think they
That house was torn down when they changed the road.
Dave,
Yes.
before Dwight Martin came, Dwight and Karen, there was another fellow came up from the city. He bought it from
The Downings.
Clancy.
Okay.
Okay, and he was the one that put the pool in. and he was the one that covered the inside of the house with 1/4-inch artificial planking plywood. Enough to make you vomit when you went in there.
There was strange things that
He
happened
really,
in the
he
house.
really did a disaster
and,
to it.
and Karen did a lot to improve
Restored
that.
it, right.
Also, it's a photocopy, but you'll notice as you go around, notice the columns on the front porch, Greek Revival. Notice the Victorian columns on the side porch. They have since been changed because Karen couldn't stand the fact that there were two different kinds of columns on the building. And for those of you who know Karen, yeah, well, that makes sense. That's Karen. So Karen made a lot of improvements like that on the property, but I'll pass this around for you to look at.
David, if I can interrupt.
Yes.
I forgot to mention that I brought Sally O'Brien, one of Sally O'Brien's scrapbooks, because she's done several drawings of the house and the outbuildings. And I wondered
great.
if any of them that you drew are ones that's not here now.
No, all the ones that you drew are still here. Here I am talking for you, but the wonderful hangings, the wonderful hangings in the library incorporate many of those views and drawings for it.
Beautiful.
And they'll go on display again in the new library, I would hope, because they're just such a treasure. Let's walk around the house now, and I'll point out some other details.
Could I just mention something?
Sure.
About 20 years ago, when Charlie Tripp was the president of the Historical Society, we took a walking tour of many of the houses in Millbrook, and this is when we stopped at, and Mrs. Day owned it. And she walked us around, and that barn, that white barn over there, I'm sure it was that one, perhaps it was this one, but I think it was that one. Anyway, Judge Morey was still alive at the time, and he stored a lot of his old furniture he hadn't refinished. And she was saying that, when they bought the house, that, the previous owners had rented that to Judge Morey, and they were anxious for him to get the furniture out because they wanted to do something with that, building, but it was filled with furniture from Judge Morey.
Yeah.
Oh, Judge, I'll fix it one way or the other.
Okay, just a quick point, and this would relate to what Bob was saying. Edgar did not leave or just casually give up the farm and say, well, I'm just going to sell it. He painfully sold it. He labored. Nobody, if you don't know apiculture or pomology, you don't realize how labor intensive it is. And when Edgar hung on, he hung on by his teeth. Labor intensity is tremendous. And that was the thing that really caused him to sell. It was the inability to get adequate labor. He didn't have your dad, he had Rufus, and Rufus used to set fire to the strawberries with his cigar falling into the mulch.
Well, let's take our walk around and see it from the front. And bring the picture, too, so we can compare.
He cut one down. It was,
No, you didn't.
I forget what it was, about 165 years old. They counted the arranging.
So that is an addition that wasn't here when we were here 20 years ago with the days. Excuse me, I'm looking right into it. The size of these trees are absolutely gorgeous.
Aren't they? They're so big.
Sad, kind of sad. I think go on, I think about
David, you said that someone changed the columns.
Yeah.
Now these were the original columns
those are the ones that were here.
And those were the Victorian ones over there.
And they were, Karen changed them around because she couldn't stand the fact that Karen Martin Shrubsole. Karen lived here
When did she live before the days or after the days?
before, and she sold to the days.
Okay.
Okay, looking at the front, a word about the details of it. It's a little deceptive, but if you look closely, it's not symmetrical. Now it looks symmetrical
the windows
because that was the intent, but the original house, was a side hall house. So what you would have had is the doorway that you see, the two windows for downstairs, front and back, formal parlor, which it still is, and then upstairs you would have had front and back bedrooms, a small bedroom at the end of the hallway, and a hallway behind. So the original house was actually, if you think of it as a 3/4 bay, 3 units. Then this section was actually recessed half the depth of the house, and had was 1.5 stories. So you had 2 stories in the main box, 1.5 in the back. Now, for those of you who remember the inside of the house was surprisingly awkward in its layout because it was never a center hall colonial. What the Merritts did, probably about 1850, was build another room on this side, which the Downings used as the dining room, and put a bedroom above it. You follow what I'm saying? When they raised it. So you had the footprint of a smaller house in an L with a new addition built to make it symmetrical. The photograph from the 1870s that's going around shows you the way it was reconfigured to make the house bigger. Now the interesting thing is most of the houses in Harts Village were side hall colonials. The house right next to us, which is the Rudy family now, that was originally a side hall colonial, and the same thing happened. And some of you may remember because Charlie Hazard, some of you know that name?
Hazard, yeah, right. Hazard would be the Hazard Mill down there.
Yeah. What Charlie Hazard did for the Downings was take that house and expand it the same way to make it into what appeared to be a center hall colonial. In point of fact, it was a side hall unit. The windows, the side lights and transom lights and fan light, if you will, are all original to the 1820s when the house was first built, as are the columns. What is the shorter wing now was added onto the house when this became the main box. There was a smaller one with the Victorian porch, and you can see that in the photograph. And what Karen did in the 1970s is add these columns to match so it would all appear to be the same. So it was updated a little bit with the units. When Frank and Barbara bought the house, it was a lot easier to tell because the windows didn't quite match for the different units, and they've gone through and they've replaced the windows now, so it's a little more symmetrical. The look is more the same, the 6/6 with the panels. Some of you commented on the trees. The trees behind the house, some of them are 150 plus years old, and many of them date to the Merritt family and when the house was first built. Others, Frank had a passion for trees, and in the 15 years that we got to know Frank, when Frank would get bored, he'd go out and plant a tree. So all the trees, the smaller trees that you see, including those flanking the driveway, were trees that Frank put in. That's part of his
Dave, there used to
legacy.
be a mounting block here. Did they take that away?
Yeah, that was gone.
Where's that
was gone by the time the Days had it. It was gone. So Karen, that's the question to ask Karen.
Yeah.
Some of you pulled in the driveway and didn't notice, but there's a charming little summer folly that was also put in by the Downing family. So that's original. And Barbara Nolan's father restored it for her as a gift several years ago. All of the wood that's in that structure came from the apple orchards. So it's all local. As we move up...
Are the apple orchards still active?
No. There's still apple trees.
Yeah.
But most of the trees are...
Hello, Alex.
I'd like to have you all meet Alex Nolan.
Hi.
She's part of the tour. Yes.
Yes, wonderful.
Alex is off to her guitar lesson. Yes?
No, I'm going like for
Drum.
2 weeks to the National Guitar Workshop.
Ah, wonderful. You have a fabulous time.
It's in Connecticut.
And if you move over, we have someone coming. Have a great time,
I got
Alex.
a jelly cabinet
Yep,
from
bye-bye.
down in the basement. Edgar, one day we were down in the basement looking at some piping and stuff, and he said, I got to get rid of that thing. I said, I'll take it home. And I hated like heck to just throw it out.
Yeah, isn't that wonderful? And this was Edgar
Great guy.
Merritt?
No, Edgar Downing.
Edgar
yeah,
Downing.
Yeah, he's a wonderful man. He was distantly related to the very famous Downing in the Hudson Valley architecture, the landscape architect. Oh yeah, he was distantly related to
Really?
that.
Now, what year would that have been that you got the job?
That's what the wire mesh is for, because they had a real problem with deers. When we first moved in,
What's new, David?
yeah, what's new? When we first moved in, the deer would come up in season and eat the apples, and what would happen is, as the apples hit the ground, they'd ferment, and when the deer finished eating the apples, many's the time that we'd look out and we'd see sort of staggering back down, but it was a very popular pathway for the apple trees. Unfortunately, on the way to the apples, the deer discovered the hosta. So that's the reason for the fencing that goes around the area now.
You know, cows, when they get in the apple tree and they eat too many, well, they'll die from it.
Oh,
yeah.
Because the blue jays can get drunk on melons.
oh, okay.
The blue jays stacking across the lawn. The cats are watching.
Well, that's a good segue into our food, so let's go and enjoy the punch.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I see that, David?
Sure.
Oh, yes, yes.
See?
Yeah, I
Little
remember
skinny
those.
ones with little brackets that ran on them.
And you say that was replaced before the Days bought it?
Yeah, Karen. Karen added the columns.
No, that was Karen.
Karen Martin Shrubsole.
Okay, because I had thought when we took the trip with the Days, with the Days
Yes.
home, that the Victorian columns were there, but I had to be wrong.
I'll ask Karen. I may have that wrong. It's possible. I see her most Sundays, so I'll ask her
Oh,
tomorrow
where
morning.
does she live now?
She is on Wellwyn with Eric Shrubsole. She married Eric after her father died. Her husband died.
She's the one that owns the house right behind the library, the blue Victoria.
Oh, okay, okay.
She owns actually several parcels
Uh-huh.
in the village.
Tree, David.
I know, it's at least 150, could be 200 years old easily.
Look at the dimensions of it.
I've always wished a tree could talk. What history they could tell.
Yeah.
How are you, Molly? Good.
And one of the interesting things about the house is that the third floor, it had a very high attic, and the third floor was converted for office space. And when we first met Frank, when they moved in, Frank would commute to the city. He was a broker. And with telecommunications being what they are, he said he never had as short a commute. He just had to walk upstairs. So they became full-time because of the technology, and that was his office suite.
Wow.
Okay, let's have our reception.
The smaller end of the house,
Yes.
the west side. Can you catch me up with that?
Sure, the little end of it is actually the Victorian end of the house. It got added on about 50 years after the house was built.
Oh, okay. And why? Like for a kitchen?
And it became the kitchen. It was the kitchen front and back.
It's funny, I looked at it, I thought, well, that was the original.
Yeah, no, the
But
original one
it's not.
is actually buried in the bigger house itself. And you can also notice the hallway front to back. Notice the fan lights on either side. They're also original to the 1820s house. This is their summer room. They just added that. There's a jacuzzi and a summer room. The Nolans have two daughters, Alex, who just left, and a younger Kelly, and they decided it would be nice to have a place where their friends could come and talk and enjoy. Plus, Alex has a passion. She plays the guitar, but also the drums. And by having them out here, it made it safe for the rest of the family.
Between the house. We got a concert from her, and then this Magnolia boy plays the drums too.
Oh, you got it for both sides.
Do you know when the orchard was put in? I don't know if I can figure this out from, let's see, it's the Downing orchard.
We have a question for you, David.
Mrs. Downing had her garden in front of the stone wall. Oh, right here there was a stone wall? And a garden, and they removed that to put in the pool. Well, now, do you know when the orchard was put in? About, so I've got
1900-ish.
Okay, because
Harold, ask Harold to think back.
oh,
For his,
Harold Armstrong?
Yeah,
Or- yeah.
Cole.
Oh,
Because
oh,
his
oh,
grandfather
Oh,
put
right.
the trees in.
Oh, that's all to do.
I think it's about 1900.
Because, you know, it's very interesting. I just finished a book, Michael Pollan, who was at our store a few weeks ago. You were there? I heard it. Have you read the book?
I haven't read his book.
I just love it.
He talked about the
Apples,
apple.
yes, that's the section he talked about. And he talked about the fact that apple seeds don't grow true to the parent tree. Did you know that? And do you know where apples are originally from?
Well, Johnny Appleseed, I think of.
Well, Johnny Appleseed, he came later in history,
Okay.
but Kazakh. That's where they have found Kazakhstan. They have
really?
60-foot trees, apple trees there, and the botanists have traced it back to that point, and it's along a silk route, so they've taken them through.
Amazing.
But the interesting thing was, he said, as Johnny Appleseed sort of stayed just ahead of the tide, as a speculator really, planting his seed, he was planting seeds that were the apple trees are not apples, did not produce apples you'd want to eat, so they would take the apples from there, and they'd have to graft the branches of trees that were good, that produce good apples. But he also said the saying, "an apple a day keeps the doctor away," originated as really a backlash, I guess, during the Prohibition, when the Prohibitionists were trying to get rid of the hard cider. And that's really what the apples were for. Right? He said people didn't normally just eat apples, I guess. It was the hard cider that they use the orchards for.
Interesting.
And so,
Feel free, by the way, if you'd like to walk around the pool, get that perspective, you see the garden that Barbara's in.
Wonderful history day.
Interesting.
Yeah, very. Oh, you had it recording?
I took out all my falls and here August 9th through the 26th. Okay. For Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday for 3 weeks in a row.
And this is at Sharon Playhouse?
No, this is over in Rhinebeck.
Oh, at the Rhinebeck.
At the Rhinebeck Theater for the Performing Arts. Yeah, I know. We finished 15 minutes early, so.
Well, that's great.
Oh, my feet are gone. Before Barbara joins us, if she's there for anything, I have a little picture to give you. Oh, how
So
nice.
let me bring that over.
Thank you. Yeah, David, I'm sorry I missed you. I wanted to find out about my house.
Well, we have it on the tape.
Oh,
And what's
great.
wonderful,
Yeah.
we have a number of people here who have associations like planting the trees for the Downings and others, so I'll fill
That's
you in.
what I would love.
This woman over here in the blue outfit is Sally O'Brien.
I know Sally.
Have you met
Yes,
before?
we certainly. Oh, my daughter Kelly.
And Kelly Nolan.
Oh,
When did you do that? 1970, 78, 80?
This one.
is this one that's in the book? In the coloring book?
Oh, I meant to show them me. I meant to leave out the little.
The photograph
Yeah.
that the merits dropped off, the one that has merit hall underneath.
Yeah, but I don't know where that would be.
Okay.
But the other thing is the window pane that was made in the house that was woven here.
Oh, and we've got a piece of it. We've got the piece you gave me.
And I made a pillow. Oh,
You made a pillow out of it.
I made a pillow out
And you
of
gave us one little
Oh, I
piece
did.
there.
That's right. So
There's a bit of homespun that's on the table.
Yeah.
That was a gift to the Nolans from the descendants of Isaac Merritt, who from the second wife, and he is now actually in Damariscotta, Maine. So those of you who know Damariscotta. And they visited about 5 years ago and brought a number of photographs and pictures that included some views of the inside of the house and photos of the oil paintings that were done for the Downing, for the Merritts, Isaac Merritt, which exists. And that was a remnant that his mother had from taking one of the homespun pieces and making it into a hostess skirt back in the 1960s. So he brought the remainder down and gave it to Barbara. Barbara's made a pillow and also gave me a piece, so we have it in our collection too.
that's what we were told. They probably wrote
Rub it on the balloon.
Yeah, Woven was here. Between, what did they say, 1850 and 1870? That's what they thought.
That's when he sold.
And over on the table,
Unbelievable.
Sally's whole thing.